Now, before we dive in with our wonderful guests, welcome Sir Simon and welcome Ben Riley-Smith. Cleo, welcome to you.
Thank
An
you very
introduction.
much.
Tell us all about your wonderful political career and now, of course, best known as a novelist.
Well, I don't know about wonderful, but my time in government was spent working for Theresa May as a political advisor during that very easy peasy period of meaningful votes, and the word backstop, which gave me shivers this week after years of dealing with that in Brussels. And then I was Boris Johnson's Deputy Chief of Staff, particularly during 2019 and 2020, which obviously was the general election and then COVID. But quite a lot of Trump fit into those few years. And then, just as you say, I've written a couple of books since then, which I think are called Bonkbusters. But they have been brilliantly reviewed on the Telegraph books page. So that's the only insight you really need about that.
Well, you're very welcome, Cleo, to the Daily Tea. Also welcome Sir Simon Fraser, former permanent Undersecretary at the Foreign Office from 2010 to 2015 and now chairman of the think tank Chatham House. Welcome to the Daily Tea, Simon.
Thank you very much.
A reader of Bonkbusters at all?
Well, occasionally, but I must say these two I haven't yet got to, but I'll put them on the list.
Shame
Excellent.
on you, Sir.
They'll be in the show notes, everybody, so you can link to Cleo's latest works and we'll just see how racy they are. And also Ben Riley-Smith, looking surprisingly fresh, Ben, given that you have literally just landed from Washington, D.C. You were on the Keir Starmer trip. Ben, how are you feeling?
I'm certainly not feeling fresh. My head is slightly whirring. I've had 2 hours sleep on the flight back over. It feels slightly surreal. The last 48 hours has been a blur, but absolutely fascinating.
Most amazing week we have just experienced. Just before we kick off, just before we started recording, the news that Anneliese Dodds, who attended Cabinet, but I think, Cleo, you were saying she was one of those attendees that were seen as being slightly on what you talked about as being the baby table, because although they're not full cabinet ministers, they have the right to attend, and Anneliese Dodds fell into that position.
Yes, there are a few people who managed to negotiate as part of their ministerial brief. They're not a Secretary of State. They do want to attend Cabinet. Well, obviously they make fantastic contributions that change the course of the country. I'm sure Sir Simon will be familiar with this. And so what tends to happen is the really significant players are right at the centre of the table, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, the Foreign Secretary, and then off towards the ends, I'm afraid, it's the Secretary of State for Wales and the what is she, the Foreign Development Minister? She's
the International Development Minister.
Well, no more.
She's no more. So just before we get to the meat of your amazing journey, Ben, and also Sir Simon, the special relationship, Keir Starmer, etc., etc., let's just do two or 3 minutes on Anneliese Dodds. Not exactly a household name, Ben, but her resignation. What does it mean for Keir Starmer?
Well, I don't think it's a huge surprise if your budget has been cut by 40% and you weren't really told it was going to happen until pretty much the day. Then you've got reason to be pretty frustrated.
And just take us through that budget cut. So how was that linked? As I said at the start of the podcast, it was linked to this big increase in defence spending.
Yeah, so it actually links to what's happening in the White House. Keir Starmer and all of the European leaders are under a lot of pressure to increase defence spending. He needed to do it quick before he went out to see Donald Trump, but he had to find the money from somewhere. So he did this big increase to 2.5% of GDP for defence spending by 2027 and then 3% the new ambition in the early 2030s. But to fund that early bit, he said, right, I'm going to cut foreign aid from the 0.5% national income target down to 0.3%. Now, Labour has forever championed foreign aid. They were absolutely hammering Rishi Sunak and Boris Johnson when they abandoned David Cameron's target of 0.7%. So it was a surprise. And if you're the aid minister and you're not really involved in that discussion because it was kept very black box in Downing Street because it was so sensitive and linked to the US trip, then you've got calls to be pissed off about it. The one other thing that I think is interesting is there's an alternative world where Anneliese Dodds is the Chancellor right now. She was the first choice of Keir Starmer when he got the job as Shadow Chancellor. Didn't do that well. Within a year she was moved, but it's kind of, to me, it speaks how Starmer can be quite ruthless. She was somebody who was an ally, a friend, and now she's going to find herself on the backbenches.
Well, it shows the journey he's been on, doesn't it? Because she obviously backed Jeremy Corbyn to become leader of the Labour Party. And in my experience, if you want to hold on to a minister, you bring them in and you cuddle them and you man mark them, and you definitely make sure they turn up for the chamber for questions yesterday, which you did. And so perhaps they're quite happy to see the back of her, in which case they don't mind her going. Maybe this is part of a little Corbynista purge.
I think it is. I
Starmer
think Starmer has realised there are not enough votes on the left of his party. He needs to move into the centre, and Anneliese Dodds wasn't helpful on that journey, given her, as you say, backing for Jeremy Corbyn. Louise Haigh, the former Transport Secretary, she resigned. Again, another backer of Corbyn. Tulip Sadiq and Andrew Gwynn have also both gone. And I think net, that has left the Labour government more in the centre, more in that kind of Blairite space, where elections are won from, I've always believed, than they were. So I don't think there will be many tears for Anneliese Dodds inside number 10. But don't forget, Ben, with Rishi Sunak's statement about the cut in international development aid from 0.7 to 0.5, that was only supposed to be temporary. And now we've gone from 0.5 to 0.3, and Labour campaigned on getting it back to 0.7. So for the Labour left, it's going to be a tricky manoeuvre.
And which party in their election manifesto had the increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027 and slashing foreign aid? Reform. And reform is the big target for Downing Street now, how to somehow counter that surge. I mean, remarkably, they are topping polls across all the pollsters right now. And number 10 is laser-like focused on how you take the poison out of that populist surge and win some of those people back.
So Simon, can I bring you in on the issue of international development aid, always seen as a Cinderella, and has slightly become controversial because of some of the things that it does back in other countries, which people in the UK think, well, why are we helping dance troupes in Ethiopia when the schools are crumbling, there's a waiting list here on hospitals, we need to deal with our own country first. How important was it as a senior official in the Foreign Office that international development aid was spent and was backed by the UK government?
Well, first of all, I mean, actually, if you think back, it wasn't always seen as a Cinderella. If you think back to Tony Blair and Claire Short, the creation of DFID, the sort of aid development superpower that we wanted to be, and then actually David Cameron, he put a huge emphasis on it. So what this shows you is how politics has changed. To your point, the focus is on the domestic situation, the fiscal situation is tight, reform are breathing down Labour's neck, and Donald Trump is changing the world. And I thought it was a really decisive and interesting move that Starmer made last week. Incredibly controversial,
on
I
defence.
imagine.
Yeah.
On defence, well, and aid. And, shifting money from aid to defence. Very controversial, I imagine, in his party, although I agree with you about the direction he's taking and the fact that he's becoming much more ruthless and decisive. But I think there will be a backlash or backwash, let's say, to this decision in the party. And if you're David Lammy, for example, the Foreign Secretary, he set out his stall for a foreign policy that was about progressive realism. You're seeing more of the realism, a bit less of the progressivism at the moment, and this encapsulates that. So they'll need to make the adjustment. One other point, there's been a lot of disruption in the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office since the merger with DFID. This is going to be a further major problem for them because they're going to have to lay more people off, close down all sorts of programs. That's going to sort of knock them back a bit.
And DFID being the Department for International
Development,
which was folded into the FCO.
Folded into the FCO, I think, under Boris
Yes.
Johnson, a couple of years ago.
And what about, why does it matter, international development? As you say, under Blair, under Cameron, it was seen as soft power was really, really important.
Well, it matters as it's part of what sort of image of your country you're projecting, but much more important beyond that. This is about short-term and long-term questions. We've got an acute security crisis emerging in Europe. We need to respond to that. That means we've got to focus on hard power. But if you reduce your aid budgets, not only us, but the Americans and others around the world, you're potentially building up longer-term problems around conflict, around migration. The big issue for this government is immigration. If you can't stabilize and get economic development in countries in Africa and elsewhere, in the longer term, what are you going to see? Demographic growth leading to even more pressure on migration. So, it's far from ideal. I know why they've done it. But, if you think long term, it's not necessarily the ideal answer.
And it's worth actually saying the cuts in foreign aid are going to be harsher and deeper than they appear on the top level, because under Rishi Sunak, they've actually been quietly hollowing out the aid budget as we traditionally understand it. So spending for asylum seekers in the UK on hotels has been shifted into the overseas aid budget. So actually, a lot of that money isn't being spent on what we traditionally think of as aid, which is helping needy people abroad. So the cut in that respect is going to be even deeper.
Of course, Trump yesterday, we're going to come to this, but he acknowledged it and he welcomed this increase in defence spending, but he said it's got to be 4 or 5%.
Which the US isn't spending.
Which the US isn't. So we've still got some way to go. But, it was, we all know why he did it. I think he did it very effectively, Keir Starmer, in making this shift. I think there may be a backlash later on.
Yeah. Ben, let's go. Let's dive into those last 48 hours, a bit longer than that, 72 hours. You set off with Keir Starmer Wednesday afternoon. Mm-hmm. Where was that from? Was it from Northolt as usual? You're whisked out to Northolt? No, Stansted.
But the VIP bit of Stansted.
Real luxury. Well, let's go back over the detail of the last 48 hours. You were there, Ben, every step of the way with Keir Starmer. His prime ministerial plane left from Stansted on Wednesday afternoon. You were there in the Oval Office. Quite a remarkable bit of Trump riffing that you experienced. And you kept a diary for us, which we asked you for, a video diary of each day and how the whole trip developed.
Hello, Ben Riley-Smith here, the Daily Telegraph's political editor, speaking to you mid-Atlantic from the plane where Keir Starmer is whizzing his way to see Donald Trump in Washington. Every US-UK leader meeting is significant, but this one feels particularly so, for a couple of reasons. Well, first, of course, Ukraine. We don't know yet the specifics of this peace deal that the White House is trying to negotiate, or this peacekeeping force that Keir Starmer is offering the Brits and Europeans to play after any ceasefire in Ukraine. So that's one we're going to watch really closely. Secondly, I think Donald Trump seems to be one of those politicians who's affected by the last person who's in his ear. That was Vladimir Putin earlier in the month. It was Emmanuel Macron, the French president, earlier this week, and Keir Starmer hopes to be that person nudging him towards Europe. And then, of course, there's this softly approach that the Prime Minister's taken towards Donald Trump. He's been very careful not to anger him, not to jump on every one of his comments. This week will be a real test of that strategy. We had Keir Starmer standing just over there a moment ago for what's called the huddle, where reporters get to throw questions at him. He seemed unusually to be pretty reticent to say that much. I think they're trying to keep a lid on the details of whatever's being negotiated behind the scenes. How will he get on? Well, we'll find out in the next 36 hours or so. Hello from the White House on a rainy Thursday morning. You can see it there behind me. It's a couple of minutes until Keir Starmer drives in just over here to see Donald Trump. Overnight there have been some fascinating developments, particularly around this idea of security guarantees. What will America promise Britain and other Western troops that they'll do if they are sent into Ukraine as a peacekeeping force? We're beginning to get a sense of what the British want. They want air cover. That could be surveillance, but it could also be a determination to act if Russia took a move on those Western forces after any peace deal. The problem is Donald Trump seemed pretty reluctant to do that. Late on Wednesday, he said he didn't want to do security guarantees very much at all. That seems really at odds with London's position. That's one of the key things to watch for when they meet in just a few minutes at the White House here.
President Trump, can you get a peace deal done in Ukraine? Yes. How confident are you, sir?
Yeah, well, Mr. Prime Minister, will you get a backstop with you?
President, do you still think that Mr. Zelensky is a dictator?
Did I say that? I can't believe I said that. Next question. Perhaps you'd like to say what that very important paragraph...
Yes, so this is a letter from His Majesty the King. It's an invitation for a second state visit. This is really special. This has never happened before. This is unprecedented.
Hello from the White House press area where we've just come out of the Oval Office. Donald Trump had a huge amount to say on British relations. He was taking questions for what felt like about 30 minutes, including some from the Telegraph. Firstly, on security guarantees, I got the chance to ask the President, would he come to British troops' aid if there were peacekeeping in Ukraine and we came under attack from Russia? To be honest, he prevaricated for quite a while and he said, look, I think British soldiers could deal with it on their own. But eventually, when pressed, he did say he would help Britain if needed. I also got the chance to ask Donald Trump whether he backed Keir Starmer's deal to give away the Chagos Islands. We haven't had his position yet to date. To the surprise of some, including Tory critics, he basically said yes. His instinct was he would sign off the deal. He noted that it lasts for 140 years. I glanced at a couple of the number 10 people in the office and they raised their eyebrows knowingly when that dropped.
Keir Starmer has signed the deal to give away the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. Will you approve that deal?
Well, we're going to have some discussions about that very soon, and I have a feeling it's going to work out very well. They're talking about a very long-term, powerful lease, a very strong lease, about 140 years, actually. That's a long time, and I think we'll be inclined to go along with your country.
But there were some more concerning signs for the government. Donald Trump did imply he trusted Vladimir Putin. He said he thought the Russian president would keep by his word in a peace deal. But there was a hint that possibly Britain could get a carve-out on tariffs. Donald Trump said, we'll take a look at that.
We've had great discussions on trade, and I think we're going to have a deal done rather quickly as it can be done. We're going to have something, I think, rather quickly. We expect to do that.
More good news for Downing Street here. Donald Trump said explicitly he was expecting to exempt Britain from tariffs. So add that to Chagos, add that to the warm words that he's heaped on Sir Keir. I think Downing Street will be feeling pretty pleased with themselves as they head to the airport and fly back to Blighty.
Well, Ben, you seem to ask two of the most significant questions of the trip. One on Chagos Islands and one on Ukraine security. Just give us your overview. Now you've flown back, as you say, you've had hardly any sleep. What's your overview of how Number 10 and the government will be thinking one day on?
I think Number 10 will be pleased, very pleased. There was a lot of political peril in this meeting. I mean, when you talked to them privately on the way there, they admitted they didn't really know what he was going to say. So unpredictable, the US president. But they have come out with some clear ticks. Firstly, and possibly most importantly, the two leaders seem to get on genuinely. Donald Trump seemed to be radiating that. He heaped praise on him. Yes, there's always a bit of that diplomatically, but that's not always true. You know, Theresa May and Donald Trump didn't particularly see eye to eye with her. This is their first meeting, despite all that old tremendous friendship. It's their first meeting in face-to-face as leaders, and it seemed to go pretty well. So I think they will be pleased with that. I mean, I think some people are surprised by how generous President Trump was in his praise of Keir Starmer. And then you had a couple of clear ticks or wins, undisputedly, really, for Number 10. The first one was the Chagos Islands. For months and months, there has been this idea that the Trump team do not like the deal that Keir Starmer has struck, which is to give away British sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius and essentially rent back on a century-plus long-term lease the US military base on Diego Garcia, one of the islands. You know, people like Marco Rubio, who was Trump's Secretary of State, have been critical in the past, the idea that it could let the Chinese get a hold or increased influence in the Indian Ocean. And this was the first time. I mean, the big question has been, where is Donald Trump on all this? He hasn't voiced his opinion. This was the first time we heard it. And to the surprise of quite a few people, especially in Westminster, when the Tories have been going hard on this, he was pretty supportive. He said, look, 140 at least sounds pretty good to me. I need to see the details. But essentially...
like it's a hotel deal.
Yeah.
Exactly. and I think that speaks to what Downing Street is arguing behind the scenes. They're basically saying, you are not paying a penny. We are paying it, and you are getting the use of the base. This is a brilliant deal. And that argument seems to have chimed. And the second clear big tick was... on tariffs, and came in that press conference at the end of the day, where when asked, he said, Keir Starmer's a great negotiator, and yeah, I am minded to exempt Britain from my tariffs because we're going to do a free trade deal of sorts. I think our understanding is it's going to be a specific one on technology, future technology, and then might widen out into different sectors. So those are two big ticks for Downing Street. But there's a huge question mark, if not a cross, which is on Ukraine and security guarantees. The biggest demand from Keir Starmer going into that meeting was, look, I and the French and possibly European allies are willing to put boots on the ground in Ukraine to defend and enforce any peace deal that Donald Trump is pushing hard on, but fundamentally is only going to work, is only going to deter Vladimir Putin if the US provides some quote-unquote backstop or security guarantees. I asked Donald Trump explicitly there, look, if British troops come under fire from Russia, are you going to help us? And he prevaricated. He said, British troops will be fine on their own. And then when I said that sounds like a no, he eventually said, well, we'll always be able to help Britain if we want. But that is sending alarm bells ringing in Number 10. I'm sure will be a point of discussion this weekend when European leaders fly into London. Because can a peacekeeping force really work if America is not overseeing and protecting and backing them up?
And he also made the joke about could Britain fight Russia on their own. So I think he sort of said, I'll always stand by Britain, which obviously is a relatively open-ended
to which
thing
Keir
to say.
Starmer didn't
Yes.
answer. He kind of laughed nervously.
Yes. Cleo, this was Theresa May. I think you actually arrived in Number 10 just after Theresa May had done the visit to see Donald Trump in 2017.
I came after the glorious 2017 election,
Yes.
so it was a great time to be there.
So she actually went a month earlier in the cycle than Keir Starmer managed to get there. And I think she was the first Western European leader to go. So Keir Starmer was second to President Macron. So maybe if you read the tea leaves, maybe a little too deeply, but you could say that Starmer's not been quite as successful as Theresa May was. But do you agree with Ben that Theresa May found it harder getting on with Donald Trump and that the chemistry was more difficult?
Well, I think he was obviously more of an unknown quantity then. We've had quite a few years to observe the guy now, and he really has hit his stride since winning a new term. So that has given, I think, Starmer and Jonathan Powell and Peter Mandelson a bit of an advantage because there's so much more material on him and how he works and how he negotiates. She's obviously not naturally the most sort of rambunctious person, but actually she figured him out fairly well. Behind the scenes, she's quite direct, and he seems to actually appreciate someone being very straight with him. And quite similar to Starmer yesterday, I thought she sort of let him chat his way through the press conferences, partly because she's just a more reticent media operator, I suppose. But the great thing to have in your pocket is always an invitation from the monarch to come to the UK and have sweetness and light showered upon you. And that's basically a kind of trump card that nobody else can necessarily deliver. The other thing is that, and perhaps this is one for Sir Simon, but these kind of trips, you tend to have a lot more time to prepare. You get a lot of recce's under your belt. Theresa May's team, there was a secret mission where both her chiefs of staff and the National Security Advisor and her Foreign Affairs person, they flew out many weeks in advance to pave the way as much as they could. And actually this time, there will have been recce's, but it sounds like the Number 10 team was slightly flying blind for what they were hoping to get out of it, which is, I would imagine, quite surprising. Or do you think that in this kind of Trump era, it's just what's to be expected, Simon?
Well, first of all, I agree that it was a successful visit. If you look at the range of possible outcomes from sort of abject failure through sort of neutral damage limitation to stonking success, I think they'd think it was nearer the latter end of that spectrum, so they'll be pleased. An awful lot of work will have gone into preparing it, actually, and we know that Jonathan Powell's been working the Chagos thing quite hard. I know that Peter Mandelson's been very focused on this whole idea of a tech-related trade deal. So you can see that the bits were being put in place on the bilateral stuff. And, of course, the royal visit, the state visit, which, as you say, is a particular card we play. So I think they will have prepared this. They will be pleased with the range of outcomes. I think the Chagos thing is an upside, as you're implying, definitely. Although I think they've been a bit more confident of that in recent days. So, yeah, on the Ukraine security issue, if we're coming to that one, which is I think actually to some extent the media is looking for a downside story here. I don't think it is a downside story. I very much doubt that they were expecting to get anything from Donald Trump by way of a commitment on American involvement in security in Ukraine. This is a negotiation. If he put that on the table now, he thinks the Europeans would just sit back. He's not going to do that. What he's saying is, you show me the colour of your money, and then we'll see where we go. We don't even know what the deal's going to be anyway. So I think that I would be less concerned. I think these are early days in that negotiation on that particular issue. And also, remember, one of the things Trump is saying is that there will be American civilians on the ground as a result of this rare minerals deal that's being signed today. In my view, American civilians are not going to deploy on the ground in Ukraine unless they have American security guarantees. So I think there's a number of factors to come through in this conversation. Let's see where we go. The meeting that Starmer is convening on Sunday of European leaders, I think is really important in this sense, because what Europe needs to do is go back to Washington and say, look, here's what we're offering. Now, this is what we need. We aren't yet at that point.
And just to echo that point about the minerals deal, I think it's incredibly significant when you talk to UK officials, they echoed that. Their argument was American economic interests equal American national security interests. And if they have money on the ground in Ukraine by getting some of these rare earth minerals in drilling in the coming years, then Donald Trump will feel personally invested. And if Russia comes again, he will act. And actually, in between so many different lines poured out of that Oval Office question and answer session, but he did say at one point, look, I think there is a backstop, and the backstop is I'm putting money in the country, and that means something to me. So they kind of echoed that argument. So actually this week, and Volodymyr Zelensky is in Washington on Friday to sign this deal, could be a really significant moment in Ukraine in a way that's slightly gone under the radar, possibly.
God, that word backstop gives me absolute PTSD.
Yeah, no, I think backstop is not a good word. I agree with you for exactly the same reason. But actually, it's important to understand what the Europeans are looking for. They're not really looking for American boots on the ground, but there are strategic capabilities like air cover, and they want ammunition and so forth that they need. And the reality is that Europe cannot undertake significant operations because of the integrated nature of NATO without American support. So it's about working out what sort of strategic underpinning, as the word I like to use, they need for any such operation should it come about.
Simon, how soon should we be thinking, or will the FCO already be thinking? Because I think, Ben, you're absolutely right about this was a good week for Starmer. He's had a lot of bad weeks since he won the election last summer. He's got terrible polling numbers. There has been a slight uptick for Labour in the polls. When there are big foreign crises dominating the media, the Prime Minister usually wins out there because, of course, Kemi Badenoch, Nigel Farage, they just get a lot less airtime for any of the arguments they're making. Domestic issues seem to be a little more de minimis. But Simon, Donald Trump is only going to be here for 4 years and the clock is already ticking. I think, Ben, you're right that with Donald Trump there, Putin won't reinvade Ukraine. And I thought, interestingly, Ben, to your questions, he did say we're going to try and get some of the land back. Now, whether he means that any more than I think Zelensky's a dictator, did I really say that? You never know how much substance there is in the points he makes. But he did at least say we want to try and get some land back. But Trump will only be there for 4 years, Simon. Will the FCO already be thinking, yeah, but what about what happens next?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, there's a sort of strategic judgment that has to be made, which is whether American policy, this is a sort of secular ongoing change in America's attitude towards European
blip
security.
or trend, yeah.
And I think the answer is we have to assume it's a trend. I think with Trump 1, we sort of hoped it was a blip, but he's been re-elected. The guy has actually been re-elected.
Why would you hope it? That's interesting, Simon. Why would you hope it was a blip?
Because, of course, we are invested in the current system of the Western economic and security cooperation, and if that's going to change, then we have to adjust to it. And we want to have a positive relationship with America. That's British foreign policy position. But I think we now have to review that, and we have to respond accordingly. And therefore, to some extent, what we're doing is trying to buy a bit of time here. If the American relationship is going to change, we are massively invested in it. We can't just walk away from it. So we need to get the best out of it. That's why the government is engaging with Donald Trump. We need to deal with the world as it is. We need to have a constructive relationship with him, but not become complicit in things we don't like about what he's doing. But at the same time, the other side of the coin, which we haven't discussed, is what are we doing about our relations with our European allies? And personally, I think this is a huge potential opportunity for the UK to reframe the debate about our position in Europe, taking it out of the sort of Brexit-specific conversation to a much bigger set of issues, which is what are our collective interests and priorities and strategic necessities here in relation to Russia and China and America, and how over time do we develop that? It is really only the very beginning of that conversation.
And also, as much as American leadership obviously has changed, many European countries have changed too. We've seen big changes in Poland, Germany, particularly on the kind of eastern side. So it would be interesting to know, particularly with changes in the Foreign Office around foreign aid. Now you said there are going to be job cuts and mergers and much office shifting. How diplomats see the next 5-10 years going, whether this is a blip not just in America but in Europe too, culturally and domestically, and how we engage and how we find common ground.
So I think what they would say is we need to, it's the old adage, isn't it, hope for the best but prepare for the worst. I mean, I actually am one of those who believes that we are seeing a trend of change in Europe as well as in the United States towards a sort of what we might call an anti-establishment neo-populism, and we've got to deal with that and the issues behind it, and you see it coming through in different countries. And if we continually just keep circling the wagons of centrist coalitions against these forces, that's not going to work. So I think there are some really important issues to be addressed there, and we need to think through them. But I think equally, we are democracies. We are the European democracies and North American democracies, and indeed those in Asia, represent something and stand together. And I think there's still power and force in those relationships. We need to find a new way of talking about them and engaging with them. And also making sure that Donald Trump doesn't follow the flights of his own rhetoric, but actually gets engaged and understands the realities. And I think that was part of what Starmer was trying to do yesterday. He was trying to say, look, we'll support you, but the sort of deal we need and you need, Donald Trump, is one which is lasting, is one which doesn't invite further conflict, and which actually creates an environment where our economies can flourish. That's the way we've got to do it. So actually foreign policy has got to engage on nitty-gritty issues.
Ben, you were going to jump in on the land back issue. Is there any,
Yeah.
what was your take on that answer?
I was just thinking about it on the way back on the plane, actually. I just it's so surprising that he said it and it came out of the blue. And I just wonder if the reason he said it is the spread of rare earth minerals in Ukraine, or the original land of Ukraine, of sovereign Ukraine. Because whenever you look at that map, a huge chunk of them, and whenever you see it in the newspapers, are sprinkled in that area of land that Russia has taken. So if he's thinking, well, how do I get the best out of my investment, the best out of this deal? Well, if you're going to take some land back, if you took a chunk in that area, then suddenly you get a lot more money out of it.
We've been thinking a little bit about the changes of leader, and obviously we've got Donald Trump back in the White House. I was part of the May administration, and then I segued into the Johnson administration. I think one of the few who managed to make it without coming out bloodied until the end. And obviously one of the quite interesting things about Johnson coming in, he's got a completely different personality to May. He's got a different media operator. He's obviously a very different diplomatic operator. It perhaps helps that he'd been Mayor of London and Foreign Secretary, so he has a bit of that kind of salesman showmanship, arguably perhaps a bit less detail than someone who's been Home Secretary.
Politely put.
But he did have a very good relationship with Trump. They used to have very cheerful phone calls that we used to listen in and get readouts from, and it was quite an extraordinary meeting of minds. And it obviously helped for Johnson, I think, when he came into office in 2019 with the Brexit deadline looming. I would say not necessarily the help from his European friends that perhaps Starmer had this week from Macron in helping him prepare for his meeting with the president. But Trump was already very warm towards him. Whilst May was still in office, Johnson was set, I think just before he came to Chequers. Do you remember when Trump came to Chequers to meet her in 2019? And he'd said just before arriving, oh, Boris is a great guy. He'd be a terrific leader.
He was uncomfortable for Theresa May.
Yeah, it was very uncomfortable, and she had to sort of stand there and see Air Force One or whatever it's called come down. But Johnson is very good at building this natural rapport with someone, and obviously the negotiations behind the scenes are a little bit different, and it sounds like the behind-the-scenes talks went very well for Starmer. But one of the things I was keen to ask you about, Ben, is the bit we did see He obviously did have his, what I'd call the trump card, the letter from the king, but it was a very deliberate and precise handover. And I just wondered how his performance came across, particularly in the room.
Well, I thought it was really fascinating because when you think about Keir Starmer as a politician, one of the criticisms that's endlessly thrown at him is he's not a brilliant political performer. He's not like Boris Johnson. He doesn't ooze charisma. He doesn't have this kind of soaring rhetoric. He can be a bit staccato in his delivery.
And he's not very funny. Because I imagine, listening in, I imagine, Cleo, to those conversations between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump would probably be also hilarious.
Yeah, it was hilarious because Johnson was on the back foot slightly because Trump would say,
it's like a
autumn
monologue of
2019 when we had this, but the Brexit deal looming, or the deadline looming anyway. Trump would say things like, "Oh, I know a great tactic. You should just sue the EU for $1 trillion." And even, when you've got Johnson saying, "Oh God,"
think about that one.
Anyway, Ben, yes,
yeah.
go on.
So
how
that
did
is
he
the
do
image.
with the
Well, that
letter?
is the image of someone. I think he did brilliantly. Clearly it was totally planned. I would have been amazed if they hadn't staged it beforehand. Keir Starmer is a guy, one of his aides told me previously, when he was doing PMQs as opposition leader, he would watch back and analyse his performance like they do on Monday Night Football on Sky News to say, okay, question didn't land. Why? How do I get better? He's very competitive and very self-analytical and things like that. So he withdrew it from his top pocket with a flourish. Heaped on the kind of uniqueness of this unprecedented special, like a kind of parent giving a child some huge toy for Christmas that they have to protect. And Trump lapped it up and he opened it and he said, "Oh, I hope this letter is signed." And I just thought it was interesting that for someone who is criticised often as not being a good political performer, he absolutely nailed that moment.
Yep.
Simon, how important are the flourishes when you're thinking about the different prime ministers and foreign secretaries that you will have served? Obviously, you're in the kind of engineering bit of the business. You're about making sure these things work for the politicians. How much difference does it make?
Oh, it does.
Who's in charge?
It does make a difference. I mean, the style and the personality matters, and also the individual relationships matter. So everybody talks about Thatcher and Reagan, Blair and Bush too, and they did actually get on with each other, and that makes it all so much easier. But then the flourishes matter. I agree. So I would say with Starmer, obviously this is not a sort of relationship that's made in heaven. They're very different people. Personally, I thought Keir Starmer looked a bit nervous because he was showing the strain a little bit at times during that press conference, and I'm not surprised. But he handled it really well, and he got his points across. And I do think there does seem to be the basis of a relationship there between the two of them, which is really interesting. It does matter. And then, of course, these sort of gesture things, the presents, the gifts, the invitations, you can work with them. And what they're doing here, quite rightly in my view, is they're playing Trump's personality. They're flattering him. And I think for example, things like Chagos and in the future discussion on Ukraine, you give him the win. I'm sure they're finding ways to make him feel that he's sort of finalised it and that he's the person who's really brought it home. Fine, that's fine. It doesn't matter who takes the credit as long as you get the result.
And they definitely did that in the talks. Keir Starmer was saying, "Thank you for your leadership on Ukraine, Mr. President," and the deal is only possible because of what you've been doing.
So I think the issue for Starmer there is that he, in his own party and elsewhere, is that he doesn't appear to be toadying too much. This is my point. You've got to be pragmatic. You've got to deal with the situation you've got. You've got to be constructive, but you've got to avoid becoming complicit. And I think he's done quite well, for example, on Ukraine and Zelensky and Putin, in putting down the markers where we don't agree, but not allowing them to become major issues that are blocking the conversation. He's done that skillfully.
Ben, you've been on trips before with prime ministers to America. I'm interested in that, but I'm also interested in what is it like being in the room? Because also, as you just mentioned, sitting there with Donald Trump, it's the Donald Trump show, and then there's Keir Starmer sort of sitting next to him, almost like the sixth form prefect who's in with the headmaster.
He didn't pick a single question.
No,
it was always
he didn't pick a single question. And at one point, Trump rather airily waves at him and says, "Do you want to say something?" Almost as if he'd forgotten that the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom was sitting next to him. He looked Keir Starmer. Trump's a big guy. Keir Starmer looked sort of physically small as well as politically much smaller. And then you have these sort of sofas laid out with J.D. Vance, Marco Rubio, David Lammy, sort of sitting there totally mute, apart from
one moment when
J.D. Vance suddenly was asked to speak about freedom of expression and wasn't useless in Britain.
Yeah.
I mean, what is the atmosphere like?
Well, I mean, it is totally synthetic and weird because you have people who are about to have a cosy meeting and then a pack of about 40 journalists and cameras watching on, and the people on the sofas kind of awkwardly looking back and forth and trying to keep their heads down. I mean, it is huge fun and a massive privilege as a journalist to get into the Oval Office and get the chance to shout questions to the president. I mean, frankly, part of our job is to somehow, as you'll remember from your broadcasting days, nudge your way to the front, try and get in his eye line. And it seemed, I was lucky enough to get 2 questions in. The trick seemed to be talk loudly and over everybody else, and also try and keep as much eye contact with Trump as possible. So he loves that moment when he's waiting and everybody's hollering, and he eventually
did he say that you were one of the good-looking ones?
No, that was Christopher
He did say a couple of them were
Hope.
good looking. Yeah, Christopher Hope.
Writes Peter Bedard used to be a telegraph.
How disappointing
GB
for you.
News. I know. No
Former
compliment.
colleague and now, GB News, and also writes our diary, as you say, was one of the good-looking ones.
Yeah, but I mean, what is quite interesting with Trump is he does actually, he's not a politician. He doesn't answer every question with the bit of script that they agreed beforehand. So you do feel like you're having a genuine dialogue. He does seem to be processing your questions, having a think, and he could be incredibly dismissive, or he could think, I'm not going to go there. But so there is a kind of authenticity or realness to that exchange.
I thought what you saw was, I mean, he's a smart operator, Trump. He was very smart in the way he handled that, and the way, I mean, his response on the Zelensky dictator question I thought was really interesting, and he sort of closed it down, he moved, but he did what he needed to do to prepare his position for the talks today with Zelensky. Right.
So to remind people on the dictator thing, he obviously a couple of days ago, he in a long Truth Social pitch, he called Zelensky a dictator, and somebody asked, "Oh, do you still think he's a dictator?" And he kind of paused theatrically and said, "Did I ever say that?" And
I can't believe I said that.
I mean, that would have floored Biden 6 months ago because people were saying he's senile, and then that's been largely just glossed over.
It is amazing, to that point, Claire, it's amazing how quickly there has just been a total move to the fact that there will be a deal with Russia, the war will come to an end, and Russia will gain land. We've had to, the Overton window has shifted.
It's barely been a month. He's barely been in a month.
And Starmer has had to. I mean, I think we are all in agreement that it has been net positive for him politically. The front pages, this morning are talking about, you've got the Daily Mail talking about a bromance. You've got, the Chagos deal going through on Starmer's, what Starmer hoped would be his terms. It's pretty positive. But the issue is around, has Starmer actually got what he wanted, which was peace, but Putin going back to where the border was before the invasion? And Simon, obviously, that is not going to happen.
No, that's not going to happen. And by the way, I'd caution against assuming that anything is in the bag until it's actually
sorry, that's a very on Chagos. He may say, "Did I say that?"
Exactly.
I didn't mean it.
But I think on the Ukraine thing, look, I think a lot of us who've been looking at this for about the last year have recognised that probably this year it was going to move into some sort of negotiation, and that in any endgame, Ukraine was not going to get 100% of its territory back. So I think you're right, there's been a dramatic shift. I think the ground was moving, the thing was moving in that direction anyway. And I thought what Starmer did quite well, and he kept on making the points. He said, we've got to win the peace, we've got to not reward the aggressor, Ukraine has to have a part in shaping it, Europe has to step up, and he kept on making those points. So he was trying to get the sort of longer term picture in there. And as I said at the beginning, this is the beginning of a process. I'm not sure how long this is going to take. I mean, people are saying this could happen very fast. And I guess with Donald Trump, it could happen very fast.
A Ukraine deal.
A Ukraine deal. But actually, you've got to look at the detail of it. I mean, you've got to decide where the lines are, how they're going to be drawn, what the withdrawals are going to be, what the reconstruction agenda is, what the security agenda. There's an awful lot of stuff there.
There's one other quite interesting thing we picked up in the travelling pack where you get access to some of the players who talk to you off the record. One of them described what they called a chicken and egg situation where you have only Britain and France have gone public saying they're willing to put in troops. But all the other European capitals are saying, well, it's a little bit early, watching and waiting. And then you get the feeling they are waiting for the White House to say what protections they'll get. Yeah. And the White House and Donald Trump in this assessment were looking at Europe and saying, well, hang on, you tell me how many troops you're going to put on the table and I'll tell you what.
And you've got a really big question about Germany, which doesn't, of course, have a government at the moment. and it's hypersensitive for the Germans.
Ben, Simon, thank you so much. Ben, you must go and get some sleep.
Yeah,
I know
I
you're
need to get
still
to bed.
working. Do go on to our website and app and see all of Ben's coverage and all the analysis that the Telegraph is doing on this Starmer-Trump, probably a bit of a bromance. But before you go, Ben, and before you go, Simon, just one or two sentences to sum up the last few days.
The last few days?
Yeah.
Well, a massive win for Keir Starmer when it could have gone unpredictably badly with Donald Trump, and I think at least there is a personal relationship there that they can build on over the next 4 years.
So I would say I hope what we've seen over the last few days, not only Starmer but Macron is that, intelligent diplomacy can put things on a sort of a reasonably straighter course, and there is a hope that we can actually manage the relationship with Trump in a way that works for us.
Simon and Ben, thank you so much for joining the Daily Tea. Well, Cleo, just before we wrap up with a couple of other points we just want to maybe make, I just want to come to you because not everyone is saying this has been a total Starmer love-in. You've been commenting sometimes quite critically on Starmer's visit to the US. Just want to read out a couple of those. Kelvin Morrison, you say, Starmer came across as a slimy, sycophantic crawler of the worst sort. It was cringe-making to watch him. We also had Woody Orchard, who said, I found the whole thing so embarrassing, it was actually difficult to watch. Keir Starmer knew he had to give some impression of credibility, but was unable to appear anything but hopelessly inadequate in the presence of Trump, who towered over him. Starmer actually looked pathetic. And I suppose the point is clear, isn't it? How the establishment and maybe even the media view something and how the public might view something can be quite far apart.
Well, and also these are Telegraph readers, Daily Tea listeners. We have to wonder what some Labour members are saying as well, because there was big talk about a Love Actually moment and he was going to go and Hugh Grant the White House. And, there were lots of Labour members who wanted Palestine to be discussed. And, I'm sure there will be some disquiet amongst people who were part of Starmer's original base, when he was really from the left of the party. I think to our discussion right at the start, some of his performance and some of the reaction perhaps from the left shows his sort of shedding of some of those credentials and his sort of move to a more Blairite, Morgan McSweeney style. And as we're seeing with Anneliese Dodds, that's perhaps going to be reflected in his cabinet soon enough as well.
Interestingly, Cleo, over the past week, I think the party that has most improved in the polls is the Liberal Democrats. And I think that Starmer might start having a problem on his left. That would frankly be less bothersome to us, because I believe that's where he should always have been, is in the centre and making sure that some people, who listen to the Daily Tea can at least engage with what he's trying to do. But the risk is that the left side of his coalition collapses and starts attacking him, and they have got a home. Just like on the right there is Reform, on the left there are the Lib Dems. So it'll be interesting to see how that
he's
develops.
been so careful to watch this rise in the polls for Reform, and it really struck me this week. If I were a Conservative Prime Minister, I'd look back on this week and think, oh, that's all gone very well. Those are all the sorts of things that Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak were actually quite keen to achieve on defence and foreign aid and cosy chit-chats with Trump. And you're absolutely right. Are they carefully guarding their left flank enough? And I suspect we'll see Angela Rayner working that wing very, very hard in the coming weeks leading up to the May elections.